direction to develop some ordinance language in several specific areas, and you gave us some direction to look at the constitutional issues that are involved. Before I go to the specifics of what the committee asked us to look at, let me give a quick overview on the constitutional issues. With respect to panhandling, panhandling is a protected form of speech. It's a solicitation of alms and has historically been given very strong protection by the court systems. That's not to say that you can't regulate panhandling, but it is to say that the regulations have to be done within a constitutional framework that I'll describe in a few minutes. Likewise, among the ordinances that you asked us to look at are the so-called sit-lie ordinance for State Street. And that ordinance typically doesn't involve expressive behavior. The leading case on the subject said that there's nothing expressive, no First Amendment interest associated with sitting or lying down on the sidewalk. The government interest is in maintaining clear passageway for pedestrians in crowded business districts. Nonetheless, as you extend the hours of a sit-lie prohibition, the potential for Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment issues begins to creep in. We'll talk more about that, but I wanted to highlight those two subjects. With that as an introduction, let's talk about what proposals are going to specifically be outlined today. First, the committee directed preparation of language prohibiting urinating or defecating in public. We don't currently have a local regulation. Any prosecutions that happen in Santa Barbara happen pursuant to state law by the district attorney's office. In my experience, it is unusual not to have a local prohibition so that my office can prosecute. That's Exhibit 1 to your staff report. In addition, the committee was interested in creating a prohibition on the use of street furniture for the display or sale of goods or wares. That's Exhibit 2. The third area has to do with restricting active panhandling. And let me distinguish active and passive panhandling. Your ordinance currently defines 3 varieties of panhandling. Active panhandling, which means orally soliciting, approaching someone and asking for something. It also defines abusive panhandling, which means using intimidating behavior or following or being profane in the process of asking for something. And the third kind of panhandling is passive panhandling. And by and large, your ordinance does not regulate passive panhandling. Passive panhandling is defined to include the act of only passively displaying a sign or other nonverbal indication that a person is seeking donations. The reason the ordinance exempts passive panhandling from regulation is constitutional. It would be impossible to distinguish the difference between someone sitting on a bench with a sign requesting donations from, for example, a sign in a store window asking someone to come in. So in order to avoid that problem and to maintain the constitutional interests of those who may be begging, seeking alms, or panhandling, however you want to characterize it, the ordinance exempts passive panhandling. We're not recommending changing that at this time. What we did examine and what the committee asked us to look at was to expand what we've characterized as safety zones. These are areas where people who are the subject of being solicited, people who are being asked for money, may feel intimidated or threatened or more vulnerable. So as you can see on the slide, we're talking about adding a 25-foot safety buffer around outdoor dining areas so that a person could not approach someone sitting in an outdoor dining area on State Street and panhandle. We're proposing expanding the area around ATMs from 25 feet to some other reasonable number. As you'll see when we get to the mapping project, 80 feet may be a bit large. That's up to the committee to consider. We're proposing adding a 25-foot buffer around admission lines, particularly movie theaters on State Street. We're also proposing a new restriction that would forbid active solicitation not only from a bench, but within 25 feet of a bench. The theory being that a person sitting on a bench, minding their own business, should be able to not feel threatened by someone soliciting funds or donations from them. That, too, has a significant impact on the scope of the area of State Street that's covered, and you'll want to consider that 25-foot buffer very carefully as well. Again, we'll talk about that more when we look at the maps. Finally, we're talking about adding a prohibition on panhandling while on buses or other public transportation. Next, the committee looked at extending the existing sit-lie prohibition on State Street from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. As I mentioned, there can be cruel and unusual punishment issues associated with that. The question really comes down to whether 2 a.m. to 7 a.m. is enough time to get rest if you have nowhere else to go. And we're already operating under a consent decree coming from litigation where we're not enforcing camping rules when there is not sufficient shelter space to support the population of homeless people in Santa Barbara. The committee also asked that we look at revising the prohibition on pedestrians blocking sidewalks, which we already have, to include congregations of people, groups of people. And in the course of doing that, I uncovered the existing ordinance language that has significant constitutional issues with it. So what I've proposed back to the committee, and we'll discuss that language in detail in a minute, is a revision that requires intent to obstruct the sidewalk and refusal to comply with an order from the police to disperse. I think both of those components are necessary to lawfully restrict groups from congregating on the sidewalks because of the right to peacefully assemble and protest. Finally, as you raised on June 10th, we've added language allowing the library director to produce regulations that would govern the use of library facilities, including the Central Library Plaza. We currently have similar power for the Parks and Recreation Director for park facilities, and it made sense to extend that to the Library Director for the facilities under her control. Let's look at the legal framework. The basic rules are that the government can regulate the time, place, and manner of free speech without censoring it. You can't tell me what I can say and what I can't say, but you can tell me when, where, and how I might say it. So carrying that forward to panhandling regulations, which are a form of speech, it is legitimate and has been upheld by the courts to regulate the when, where, and how a person can solicit funds. There's a well-known test that I want you to be aware of because as you analyze these issues, it's very important that you are deferential to the constitutional rights involved. Let's make no bones about it. The Constitution must be respected if we have any opportunity to defend these regulations successfully. So the first rule is that the regulations have to be content neutral. You can't distinguish a homeless person panhandling money from a Girl Scout asking for money for cookies. It's essentially the same act, and the regulations apply in a similar fashion to both. So I believe we passed the content neutrality test by not limiting the nature of what's being solicited in the regulations. Any solicitation is covered. Secondly, and this is a bit of a mouthful, the regulations need to be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. You'll recall that back in June, I asked the committee to focus on what the governmental interests involved were. And you talked about blockage of sidewalks. You talked about the fear and intimidation that people can experience when they're abusively panhandled, or when they're panhandled around an ATM, or while they're stuck in line or stuck sitting on a bench and can't get away, when they're essentially a captive audience. Those interests have been upheld by the courts. With respect to the sale of goods and wares on the sidewalk, the courts have also recognized that there's a legitimate government interest in protecting the bricks and mortar businesses against unfair competition. And it's viewed as unfair competition when a sidewalk merchant who doesn't have the expenses of rent and overhead competes against a bricks and mortar type of merchant. There are constitutional overtones there as well, because many times the products being sold are expressive themselves. The classic case that I identified in the paper came out of Honolulu, where street sidewalk T-shirt vendors argued that they had a First Amendment interest that was being infringed by a regulation against street sales. The court rejected that argument in part because, as I said, the city had a legitimate interest in protecting the bricks and mortar businesses from competition, as well as protecting the streets and sidewalks against the crowding and obstruction that happens if people are queuing about an area to buy things. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for the analysis today, the regulations have to leave open ample alternative channels of communication. What that means is that you can't ban panhandling in the entire city, nor would I advise banning panhandling in an area so large that it comprises the majority or bulk of State Street. You have to leave open areas where people can panhandle, and we'll get to that when we look at the maps. The maps are designed to show you the open spaces where panhandling is still allowed. You'll ultimately need to make the legislative judgment whether those are ample areas for this alternative communication, ample locations for panhandling to take place. But we've mapped it so that you've got a visual showing the areas where panhandling would be allowed and where it would be prohibited. I mentioned that the time, place, and manner test applies to the goods for sale, safety zones, sit-lie. I mentioned the Eighth Amendment. Let's talk about that a little bit further. The case involving Eighth Amendment concerns came out of the city of Los Angeles and involved an ordinance where the city forbade sitting or lying on sidewalks anywhere, anytime in the city of Los Angeles. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that that was way too broad, that there needed to be some place for people who are unhoused to seek respite and sleep when there isn't shelter space available. I want to contrast Los Angeles' ordinance with Santa Barbara's. Santa Barbara's applies only to the first 13 blocks of State Street and is meant to prevent sidewalk obstruction in the busiest commercial district in town. So Santa Barbara, in my view, does not have the same problem Los Angeles did, in that the prohibition on sitting or lying down, or sleeping for that matter, on the sidewalk only applies in part of the busiest commercial district in the city. So it's quite narrowly tailored to the problem that the council was trying to solve when that ordinance was enacted, namely obstruction of the sidewalk during busy times. What comes up, though, with the proposal to extend it from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. is a judgment call as to whether you're allowing sufficient time for people to sleep and have respite. I can't make that judgment. That's up to you to make. But certainly the shorter the period of time of the sit-lie prohibition, the easier it is to defend constitutionally. Lastly, I'll mention, I did already mention the special rules for sidewalk group assemblies. The reason that we have to be careful there, and we'll talk about the specifics of the regulation in a second, is that people have a right to peacefully assemble in traditional public forums. Streets, sidewalks, and parks are the definitional public forum places where the courts have protected very stridently the First Amendment rights of people to congregate and protest or advocate. So many times you see cases involving unions that wanted to gather together to make a protest or a picket, and you see many laws that tried to limit union protesting. While Santa Barbara's ordinance clearly wasn't directed that way, it did date back to the mid-1960s before much of the more recent Supreme Court law had come out, and it would have, in my mind, overbroadly applied to protected First Amendment activity as well. So I propose some changes to that ordinance that we'll get to. Let's run through the specifics of the proposals. Urinating or defecating in public. Pretty straightforward. Let me mention that Captain Whittam is here and can answer questions about how that ordinance might actually work. Currently, what's happening is that the district attorney's office is prosecuting when it can under state law provisions prohibiting dumping in public, and that's a bit of a reach. And the fines under state law, as I understand it from Captain Whittam, are extraordinarily high, leading some trial judges to dismiss charges. So having the ability to prosecute those as a local misdemeanor or infraction should enhance the enforceability, and that's why we're proposing adding that to the municipal code. Now, the next one we want to talk about is commercial use of the city streets. As you can see, you already have a regulation forbidding sale or vending from city streets. And like the Honolulu ordinance, there's legitimate reasons for doing that. What we're proposing to add in response to the committee's direction is a limitation on using public street furniture for sale or offering for donations goods from public street furniture. The interest that you have there is that the public street furniture is for people to sit down and rest, enjoy themselves. It's not meant to be taken up as a permanent display of goods for sale or donation. So by allowing people to display goods on those benches, you basically interfere with their use as resting places for all segments of the population. I did want to talk about the panhandling safety zones, and we'll have the exact language come up in a few slides. First off, a reminder, abusive panhandling, that intimidating, ugly talk, hostile behavior is forbidden everywhere in Santa Barbara now. Active panhandling is restricted in certain locations. As you can see, we already forbid it while people are waiting at a bus stop, or in city parking lots, or in vehicles. What we're proposing to add with the underscored language in number 4 is a 25-foot buffer for outdoor dining areas. The way the regulation is currently written, it says within an outdoor dining area. I literally can't understand how that could work because most of the outdoor dining areas are restricted access, and a panhandler wouldn't be able to get inside the dining area. So I think the regulation as it's currently written needs help regardless of the committee's direction. Question?
Mr. Colon, quick question on the clarification. In the buffer zones, obviously, abusive panhandling is not is prohibited. Active panhandling would be prohibited, but passive panhandling, i.e., the carrying of a sign, is that exempt or is that included in the buffer zone?
That's exempt.
Thank you.
I could put a person during the Depression wearing a sandwich sign walking down the street asking for donations. There's no, the courts haven't identified any harm from that activity. It doesn't require me to say no. It requires nothing more than I look away. And so it's constitutionally protected. I do think you should look, I jumped onto the next slide, but I do think you should look at that 25-foot buffer as whether that is far enough, too far, or needs to be adjusted. There's nothing magic about 25 feet. The basic idea is you want a buffer that makes it so that people sitting in an outdoor dining area feel safe and don't feel like they're being harassed while they're having a meal. 80 feet.
Could it not also be a matter of vocal reach, if I can put it that way?
It could be. 80 feet of an ATM is based on Santa Monica's regulations. You'll see when we get to the maps that raises some unusual circumstances, and candidly, 80 feet might be a touch too big. We currently have a 25-foot buffer. Within that range, the committee may wish to adjust what's being proposed. 25 feet from admission queues, and as I mentioned, on buses or other public transportation. When we get to sit-lie, here's the actual language of the ordinance. It would extend the time from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. Again, you'll need to decide whether that is so expansive that it interferes with someone's ability to sleep or get rest. The committee also asked, and
May I ask you a quick question?
Certainly.
Say interfere with somebody's ability to get enough rest just in a certain area. They can go and lie on streets elsewhere.
That's correct.
Times. Okay, so we're just talking about ability to get rest in this particular location.
That's correct. And I was trying to extrapolate the worst case out of the Los Angeles lawsuit I mentioned in the paper. The other issue related with sit-lie is where does it apply? It currently applies to sidewalks and paseos. We wanted to clarify that it also includes walls, railings, planter areas, sculptures. I think those have been enforced traditionally, but we wanted to make sure that they were properly covered by the ordinance. Street and sidewalk obstruction is where the existing ordinance was unconstitutional, in my opinion. So what I've done here is add two components. First, an intent requirement that the people congregating have to be doing so with the intent to hinder or obstruct free passage of pedestrians or to block the entrance to a building. And secondly, they need to refuse to disperse when ordered to do so by the police because of an immediate threat to public safety. So we're building in quite a bit of constitutional protection that will allow groups to peacefully assemble and still allow the police to prevent unsafe situations from developing where a mob, if you will, is intentionally blocking the street and driving people out into the traffic areas. Finally, we have the library director regulations. Quite simple. The library director can produce regulations to govern the use of her facilities. Okay, let's get to the mapping. And I've placed at your desks color copies of the maps that were included in black and white in the printed packet. I believe there are colored copies online as well. I'm sorry about the poor quality of what was included in your packet. So, as I mentioned at the outset, we're looking to identify whether there are alternative locations for panhandling, pure and simple. The GIS staff identified and mapped ATMs, public benches, theater queues, paseos, and outdoor restaurant dining areas. This next slide is blurry, I know, but it's better than the micro print on your handout. You can see that ATM locations in green represent the 80-foot buffer. Benches, movie theaters, parking lot access, and restaurants in different colors represent the 25-foot buffer. Let's start by looking at the overview of State Street. You'll need to make a judgment, as I say, about whether those 13 blocks of State Street, or it's not 13, but whether the 400 through 1,200 blocks of State Street that are currently regulated still have ample locations for panhandling. To my way of thinking, there are quite a few spaces between the bubbles on that map, but again, that's a legislative judgment. When we start looking at State Street going up from the seaward direction to up State Street, we can see in a little more detail the 25-foot buffers. The gray areas shown on that map are buffers around outdoor dining areas. The pink circles show buffers around public street benches. So let's work our way up State Street. That's the 400 block. The 500 block, we have quite a bit of outdoor dining. There are some locations left open, but some significant spans where panhandling would be prohibited, active panhandling. The 600 block, we have a movie queue there where people would not be able to panhandle actively. We have the paseo going in next to the Habit that's identified, as well as the bench in front of the Habit, the public sculpture, which would be covered by the sit-lie ban as well. 700 block, some significant impacts, but also some extensive spaces where there are not benches or outdoor dining, and panhandling could take place, active panhandling could take place. I'm on Exhibit 10. Exhibit 11, we get to our first ATM, and one of the things that Captain Whittam noticed, and I would call to your attention, is that the 80-foot buffer extends all the way across the street. That might be going too far. You may need to trim that back from 80 feet to somewhere between 25 and 80 feet.
May I ask, Santa Monica uses that. What's their rationale, do you know?
I think that it's based on the amount of time that it would take a person to approach you while you're handling money coming away from an ATM. Everyone knows that it's likely that someone at an ATM is getting cash or handling cash. So having a wider buffer there decreases the chance of a robbery or of a solicitation. And I think the courts will recognize that when we're handling cash like that, we have an increased sense of vulnerability. So 80 feet is an approximation of a delay time to allow you to put your money away. Is there anything magic about it? Not that I've found. And it may apply to areas that have broader sidewalks than what we have on State Street.
Well, that at least is a defensible rationale, what they're saying.
I think it is, but I am concerned. about the extension of that green area all the way across State Street, it could be viewed as excessive. Again, it's a legislative judgment that you'll need to make. I don't have any case law that points to an 80-foot buffer as being upheld and a 25-foot being any better. It's really a judgment call at this point.
Let's discuss that more later.
Okay. 900 block, another movie queue, another ATM, outdoor dining. The 1,000 block, again, ATM and benches and outdoor dining. 1,100 block. And 1,200 block. Things start to thin out a little bit as you get up towards Victoria. And that's it for the slides. I'd be happy now to answer any questions you may have. I, again, suggest you focus your discussion on a couple of areas, namely the propriety of the size of these buffers, the availability of alternative locations, and in addition, the wisdom of prohibiting sitting and lying between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m., which is the extension we're talking about now. I'm sure you'll have public comment, and it would be appropriate to take that now, too.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cullen. Thank you for your body of work on this as well. Captain Whittam, do you have any comments that relate to what Mr. Cullen's presented so far?
Councilmember Rouse, specifically on the urination in public, I just want to give some background of what's happened recently in the past couple of years. There have been several case laws that the former city attorney had judged the city should not be using what we currently use, which is 374.3 of the Penal Code, because there was a perceived constitutional issue with that. So for about a year, we weren't using the section that we previously were using and are now using, but he recommended that we use another section, which is 370 of the Penal Code. The district attorney had an issue with that because under 370, it can only be filed as a misdemeanor, which then would give the person who is litigating that as the person going to court jury trial rights. And the district attorney's office just wasn't willing to prosecute those going forward with for urination in public just with for a jury trial. So that issue has been resolved, and we're back to issuing those. And I've spoken to the district attorney, who is now filing the current charges for urination in public as infractions, as they should be. However, because of that, and specifically under 374.3 of the Penal Code, it doesn't specifically say what we're trying to cite. What it is, it's a dumping of waste. So we're using the most appropriate section to handle the situation we have at hand. That's up for legal challenge in the future, again, as it was in the past, to the point where for approximately a year we weren't issuing proper citations for the crime that's being committed, which is a relatively low-level crime. Mr. Colon has advocated, as the police department has, is that most other municipal districts in cities and even the county has a specific ordinance prohibiting urinating and defecating in public. And that what we would be able to do is regulate that ourselves in terms of how much the fine would be, successive violations and the fine increase in those. And we could also, currently the fine for 374.4 is over $700 that a judge has to impose, and oftentimes a judge isn't willing to do that for such a low-level crime and dismisses the case. So these are the issues and the challenges that we are going for this issue, and I think it's a very good solution for us to have our own ordinance that we can regulate, and it's specific to the crime that we're trying to avoid.
Very good. Any questions from the committee before we go to public comment? Mr. Hotchkiss.
Would this take it out of the realm of a misdemeanor so there wouldn't be a threat of a jury trial?
It could be filed as either an infraction or a misdemeanor. However, most of our municipal code sections are filed as infractions. So it would be an infraction.
All right. So that would avoid the jury trial.
Yes, it would.
Thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Okay. Well, I had that question as well. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Colon. can I, not right away, but I would request, so you're saying the city attorney's office would prosecute or process the urination and defecation violations, not the district attorney's office? Am I getting that right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, and can I see what that would cost your department? Or have you already looked at what it might take in terms of your staff time and resources?
Well, that's a good question. It would be an increased resource demand. I don't know that the volume will be so high as to require any staffing changes. When we begin looking at the enhanced State Street security presence, depending on the form that takes, we could get to a situation where I'll need help on code enforcement in general. But this proposal alone does not create the need for any additional staffing.
Then a question for you, sir. So how I read the white spaces in between the dots is that we have a sit-lie ordinance now, but it ends at 9 p.m. But if we, so if we pass this, someone could stand in between and panhandle, but they couldn't sit, right?
They can, that's exactly right. They can sit on street furniture with a passive sign and solicit that way.
But one of the rules that we're thinking about passing today is that they can't sit and panhandle on
the ground.
On the ground, okay.
Right.
Okay. Can I ask you about musicians? I was having a conversation with someone today who said she actually gave a couple of bucks to somebody who was a good musician on State Street. And I know that's not someone laying out jewelry or other wares.
I think that it falls into the passive panhandling category under our ordinance because it's a nonverbal request for funds.
Okay, thank you. And then a question for Captain Whittam, please. Would it be confusing, or how would you organize your patrol and enforcement? How would your people know that that little circle is off limits and this one's open? Do you see, is that a challenge for you in enforcement, because it seems there's sort of a hopscotch?
Councilman Murillo, yes, it would create an issue and a challenge. We would handle that by training bulletin. By a training bulletin to our officers. I mean, they're very familiar with the city, especially the downtown area. We spend a lot of time down there, so these areas are corridors that would be off limits for panhandling. Before we take enforcement action, they'd have to double check that this is actually an area that is off limits. And we have officers, and I would assign officers to make sure that information was distributed and disseminated among our ranks. We have a training division that prepares and handles those issues.
Okay. And you're part of the Milpas Action Task Force, and I know we're not looking at sit-lie on Milpas in this proposal, but it is something, I'm sorry. Right, okay. But it is something that the group has talked about. Can you tell our committee about that?
Well, the Milpas Action Task Force, it's been a discussion topic item, but there's been no moving forward with it at this point.
This would be a good time to talk about it, I think, if, depending on what the public has to say. I'm really curious to hear people's reaction to what we're proposing today.
Actually, we're gonna try to keep this to actually the specific area that we're talking about just for today. We certainly can do that in the future.
You're right. We have council at 2:00. I forgot. Okay.
I would like to have one point of clarification, because you brought up the different levels of panhandling. Ms. Murillo just brought up the thing about street musicians, which elicits the idea of, okay, you got the Girl Scout cookie salesperson, thinking about the Salvation Army people ringing the bells at Christmas time. Now, what level of, that's obviously asking for alms, panhandling, if you would. So how do we parse all that in terms of what we're trying to do today?
Councilmember Rouse, you should begin with the assumption that any solicitation of alms would be affected by the ordinance. the ordinance attempts to distinguish passive panhandling, which it defines as standing there with a sign or sitting on a street furniture with a sign, from verbal, meaning oral, solicitation. And it calls that active panhandling. So the bell ringer making noise and holding a stanchion with a sign and a pot is passively panhandling, in my view.
Very good. Okay, if there's no further questions, I'd like to get the time in for public comment. And we have about 8 speaker slips. We're going to have 2 minutes per speaker, if you would. Please stay to the topics that we're talking about today. That's specifically what you signed up for. And we got more than 8 now. Very good. And so I'm going to call you up one at a time, and I'm going to call the person that's going to be on deck to please follow up so we can keep going as quickly as possible. I'm going to remind everybody about decorum, no clapping, no booing. Let's let everybody have a chance to be heard no matter what their views are. The first speaker will be Gene McKnight, followed by Tamara Erickson. And you have 2 minutes. And there's a counter on the podium for those who haven't spoken before.
Council members, thank you very much. My name is Gene McKnight, and I'm president of the Santa Barbara Downtown Organization. I want to say that we are in favor of any and all ordinances that have teeth and can be enforced to protect the individuals who are on State Street. And we have our own constitutional rights as well, we feel. We just want to make sure that we have enforcement on State Street, which is important to all of us. I did have one question, perhaps Captain Woodham or Mr. Ariel or Cologne could answer, is that in regards to the sale of merchandise, you mentioned it's on the benches. Is that also on the sidewalks? Because they do lay out everything on the sidewalks.
We can bring that up in questions afterwards. Just need to get your comments right now.
Great.
But I'll make a note of that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's Tamara Erickson to be followed by Kathy Janega Dykes.
Good afternoon, Councilman Rouse and members of the Ordinance Committee. My name is Tamara Erickson. Since 1975, my family has operated Hotel Santa Barbara in the 500 block of State Street. And to make this easier for me, I've borrowed an acronym from Old McDonald using EIEIO, so that'll make it a little easier. The E being enforcement, I agree with what Gene McKnight said. Any ordinance you create is great, but it doesn't make a bit of difference unless you have the manpower to enforce it. And so we really urge you to do what you can to get the feet on the street so that there's a presence and that there's respect for the ordinances that you spend your time creating. Image is the I. Marketing a hotel, trying to bring people downtown Santa Barbara to spend money at the restaurants is a difficult task, much more difficult when the image that they see when they get there is of having to walk the gauntlet between the hotel and Starbucks on State Street. So it's really important. Economy is the next one, the E. Hotels, as you know, generate TOT. That's 12%. 10% of that goes directly to the general fund. Those funds provide services for a lot of the different populations, including the homeless population. And in addition, our business and a lot of the businesses here are very generous in donating to the different groups that support care, compassionate care for people that need it. And that's important to us as well. Intimidation, we have a lot of foreign and elderly travelers. It's frightening, really, to be on State Street, and we educate our guests as much as we can and try to create a safe environment, but once they get on State Street, especially in that area, it's a tricky problem. And then the last one is O for odor. The public defecation and urination component of your ordinance is really important to us, especially at a time when the streets are not washed with regularity because of the water issues. And so that's a huge issue. It's very prominent down in the 500 block, and so I urge you to pay close attention to this, and also to make sure that you include fountains in the street art. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kathy Janega Dykes to be followed by Ken Albinger.
Councilmember Rouse, members of the council, my name is Kathy Janega Dykes. I'm the president and CEO of Visit Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara currently attracts over 6 million visitors a year, and this industry represents about a $1.5 billion industry, so obviously a significant economic generator. So while demand for our area continues to grow, our visitors have a lot of choices to travel to, and often safety and cleanliness are certainly a big consideration. Currently, this industry, which is, again, so vital to our local economy, is being negatively impacted by aggressive panhandling in our community. And while most members of our hospitality community are sensitive to the needs and problems of homeless people we have on our streets, the conduct, whether it's aggressive panhandling or threatening behavior by panhandlers, is an issue that needs to be dealt with. We have a lose-lose situation for both these individuals living on the streets as well as certainly our visitors as well. We promote Santa Barbara as a resort destination which is clean, safe, and enjoyable. And our problems with the aggressive panhandlers contradicts this image. We all know that Santa Barbara is a very passionate community which already provides an incredible number of services for those who choose to take it. And I urge you to consider enforcing stricter ordinances for controlling those who do not choose to seek additional services and take advantage of our visitors and our local residents. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ken Oblinger will be followed by Bob Stout. Can you please respect everybody else in the room, please, sir? Mr. Oblinger.
Ken Opplinger, President and CEO of the Chamber of the Santa Barbara Region, representing approximately 1,000 businesses here in the area and 45,000 jobs. I'll be brief. I want to thank the City Attorney for the presentation today. We are strongly in support of the package that you have been presented. I will say that if, as you discuss it, you feel the need to decrease the buffer zones around the ATMs, we would certainly understand that and would support whatever decision you came to. I would ask, though, that you take another look at the ATMs on State Street. There were at least two that I noticed that were missing. One at Heritage Oaks Bank, which has an ATM that actually is on State, which is not on the map. The other at Montecito Bank and Trust. The business faces State Street. The ATM is just off State, but I think it's impacted enough that we ought to include that with a buffer zone as well. So if you can include those, we'd appreciate that. Also, very strongly in support of the ordinance on defecation, urination, and glad to see that we are addressing that at the city level. I will just make one more comment. The question you had about the map and all the different areas there and how the police would enforce that. I think one of the nice things is that with the exception of the ATM areas, everything else is a 25-foot buffer. So I think it would be very easy for the police officers to know that in those particular areas, whether it's outdoor dining, whether it's a bench, it's a 25-foot buffer. That's the same all along State Streets. It'll be very easy, I would think, to be able to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bob Stout to be followed by Jeff Nelson.
Thank you. My name is Bob Stout, and I'm the acting chair of the Santa Barbara Downtown Organization, the Safety Committee. And I'd like to iterate what a lot of people have already said about the enforcement. That's the most important part, I think, downtown for us in the downtown organization. A couple of notes that I got, and thanks for this is really informative. You've got a great task in front of you, complicated task, and thanks to Mr. Cologne for all the information. The highlights that I just want to point out, I think that the prohibition using street furniture for display and sale of goods for sale is an excellent one. I think that does contribute oftentimes to another point, which would be the sidewalk grouping or blocking of sidewalks. I've seen around Macy's on the corner of Ortega and State, a lot of blocking right there. The defecation, urination, obviously that's something we all feel strongly about. I think the fine is too high for that. I know that may sound contradictory, but it seems pretty high, and maybe that contributes to its not being enforced. And finally, I guess that's it. Oh, yeah. Has anyone alerted the Girl Scouts?
Thank you. Jeff Nelson to be followed by Dave Lombardi.
Hi, Jeff Nelson, longtime local attorney and businessman. I've tried to figure out how the panhandlers have outcompeted local businesses. I've seen panhandlers staying for years on benches. Can you suspend my time?
Mr. Nelson, I'm going to stop your clock just for a second, please.
I tried to go to your public meeting one time and couldn't find it. I'm leaving anyhow, so you don't got to escort me on out of here. I'm absolutely disgusted. Goodbye.
Mr. Nelson, I'm going to let you have your full 2 minutes back.
Okay.
No, you're not talking to me. I'm leaving, dude.
Mr. Nelson, go right ahead. Thank you.
There's many locals who talk about this amongst themselves a lot, and they're embarrassed by downtown. They're embarrassed to take visitors here. They're embarrassed to see European tourists come and see what is presented to them on State Street. And I wanted to do something, and I've never taken a look at your ordinances, but the issue upon seeing all this is that people are allowed to monopolize public benches for passive panhandling. That's how they thread the needle. So under this ordinance, every single bench can be occupied by passive panhandlers, and so there's nowhere to sit for a European traveler in the summer because you're not taking on the passive panhandling, and that's how these people have threaded the needle. Can you deal with passive panhandling? Well, in the staff report, it says that there's little doubt that valid time, place, and manner regulations may prohibit abusive panhandling altogether while prohibiting and allowing active or passive panhandling in specified locations only. So if you were to take, say, for passive panhandling, we are not going to allow passive panhandling in the 90-foot wide corridor, which is State Street and 1.5 miles long. How much of the city would be available for people to panhandle other than taking that corridor out of play? Well, that corridor represents 0.004% of the 18 square miles of Santa Barbara. So there's plenty of places. If you take that corridor for passive panhandling out of play, there's plenty of places for people to passively panhandle and communicate whatever they want. So the staff has said you can regulate passive panhandling through time, place, and manner regulations, and that's what you need to do if you're going to get to the heart of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Lombardi will be followed by Peter Marin.
Councilmember Rouse, Murrell, and Hotchkiss, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak in front of you. My name is Dave Lombardi. I'm the past president of the Downtown Santa Barbara Organization, as well as the past chair of the Safety Committee, and most importantly, I own a business on State Street. I just want to thank you very much for this. We are very much in support of everything you're doing in the ordinances. The one thing that I want to state is that we have many ordinances on the books already, and the enforcement of the ordinances or giving the police the backup or the teeth to enforce those is paramount. And I think if we focus on that, and with these enhancements you have to these ordinances, it would be very helpful to that and to help with this problem on State Street. Also, 3 points of clarification. One, First Republic Bank on the 1200 block, there's an ATM now. And also the Chase block, even though you only went up to the 1200 block on the corner of Victoria and State Street, there's an ATM there. And also, two, point of clarification, that the street art, the Crescent Moon, is actually a bus stop. Thank you very much for all your help.
Thank you. Peter Marin, to be followed by Peter Joseph Leiden, I believe it is.
I'm here for the Committee for Social Justice. As some of you know, homeless rights or human rights are our main concern. We have several times sued the city and had those cases settled. We've sent stuff up to the Ninth Circuit of Appeals, which has always treated us very sympathetically. And one time, I'd add, compared the city's RV parking laws to the old Okie laws from the 1930s. So they tend to have a narrower view of what constitutes mercantile rights and a wider view of what constitutes human rights than some of you may have. I think the two real dangers here are the sleeping ordinance and the 80-foot and 25-foot regulations, which really do block off access to a lot of people on the city's main thoroughfare. And I hear the talk about Milpas, and I understand that once these are established, there'll be attempts to spread these throughout the cities. Our federal courts and state courts do not look happily on these kinds of things. I want you to know that we will vigorously pursue anything we see as a violation of constitutional rights, and in the past we have been very successful in doing that, and I assume we'll be successful in the future. So I just urge you to take care and try to find a moderate way that respects the needs of the mercantile interests. I understand those, but at the same time respects the unpleasant rights of the homeless. We don't like them, but they exist. The courts recognize them, and you really don't want to do anything to violate them, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Joseph Leiden to be followed by Mr. Gallegos. Not going to try to say the whole name, sorry.
I've never been here before. My name is Peter Joseph Leiden. I moved here in 1973. I got my associate in arts degree from Santa Barbara City College, which I love. I got my degree in anthropology from the University of California here. I was a gardener here, and I love Santa Barbara. Currently, right now, I'm using my clinical anthropology in studying the homeless culture, particularly in Santa Barbara, as well as throughout the state of California. I also have 25 years' experience as a clinical counselor dealing with psychiatric patients. There's just two things I would like to say. Actually three things. Number one, I'm pleased to announce that we're writing a television show based on the Santa Barbara homeless population, and it's currently in pre-production, so we're very excited about that. Second of all, I think the public health issues are critically important, particularly in this era of infectious diseases and things that are going to continue to occur that way. So I think any issue pertaining to public health, which involves all issues with the homeless, are critically important. And then finally, I think the majority needs to maybe engage this minority of mentally ill people and in a different way than what I've seen occurring. It's a different era now, post the Great Recession. It's a different era now in this century. And I think if we're really going to solve the homeless problem, we're going to have to engage this mentally ill minority that we live with. And I look forward to working positively with everyone in that regard. And I hope the TV show will help promote that understanding further as well. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gallegos, followed by Melody Joy Baker.
Good afternoon, council members. As you all know, I am a native son of Santa Barbara, and I am homeless. And I just want everybody to know that I back up all the business owners on State Street. I mean, I truly, truly back them up 100%. Something needs to be done. And I'm speaking as a homeless person. I don't like it. And sometimes when I'm walking out of a restaurant, because there's a few restaurants that I like to go to on State Street to dine or to go see a movie, and I get approached, hey, you got $1 or you got some change? And heck, I'm homeless too. And I have homeless people asking me for money. Just before coming here, I saw a woman that I met at Costa Esperanza a couple of years ago, and she has a sign, sits in front of Rite Aid. She had 2 strokes. She is disabled. She left her husband from Utah because there was an abusive relationship, physical and mental. She had to get away. And I asked her on my way over here, before I came here, I asked her, are you receiving disability or Social Security? She goes, no, I can't receive nothing until I get a divorce, and my husband does not want to sign the divorce papers because of the Mormon faith. Yes, I am against aggressive panhandling. Something needs to be done. But somebody like her, and there's a few that I know that do passive panhandling, but she's not there all the time. But, panhandling, the aggressive, I'm just totally against it. And as far as public urination and defecation, maybe have some portable bathrooms from Marlboro in certain locations, or maybe have some of the public bathrooms open 24 hours. Maybe. Not all, but a few. And something needs to be done with the seriously mentally ill. They're not being taken care of here, and I know that that's more of probably a county issue, but something needs to be done to help the seriously mentally ill and get them off the streets. And but like I said, I'm concerned, and I am concerned of the business owners. I back them up 100%, and I understand their issues. I really.
You'll need to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, okay. That's it.
Thank you very much. Melody Joy Baker to be followed by I believe Ed is the first name. I can't read the entire name. So, Melody Joy Baker here. Okay.
That was Ed.
Okay. Thank you. Tiffany Bouch. I'm going to put my glasses on. Guys. Tiffany Bouch will be followed by Oriana Wagner.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Tiffany Gouch. I'm also known as the artist Molasses Jones. I am president and CEO and chief creative officer of Sweet Entertainment, which is a multimedia company that I did while basically chasing after companies that didn't want to pay me. I created this online using the resources of the internet. Most people know me by, the times that I had to spend in line waiting for a meal or going to the Mission for dinner. I chose never to really spend much time at Casa Esperanza because the environment was very chaotic for me. So that is a little bit about me. I want to just express myself about a few items that you have here. First of all, I do want to thank the Santa Barbara community who are helping the homeless, because I have been able to use those resources to now transition out of homelessness, which feels amazing. First of all, the situation with panhandling, if Santa Barbara is drawing $1.5 billion, I don't think any panhandlers are really competing. I spoke with one gentleman, and he is a longtime panhandler. His sign, which is awesome, makes about $5,000 a year. I think he's probably doing better than most of the people in Santa Barbara. I don't think there's a way that they could possibly compete economically. The second thing is the ordinance on defecating and urinating in public. I was just wondering, what are people supposed to do if they don't have a place to go to urinate or defecate? I mean, just imagine you don't have a place. What would you do? So I just think we need to be careful about that. Let me see, officers. Oh, yeah. The other thing is I think we're doing a lot of, spending a lot of legal time on enforcement. A lot of people came in to talk about enforcement, but I was just wondering, people who haven't been in this position, they really don't know how much harassment you get from the police on a day-to-day basis. I was harassed myself, and I'm a person who has already completed my college degree, is currently applying for my JD MBA, thank God, and will continue to pursue my business interests. And I think it's tough for people who are not getting sleep, not getting medical care, and are kind of like getting kicked around to get a leg up. So panhandling is kind of like that leg up. It might not be within the laws, but here's a way to look at it. Why not have a tag or a name tag that says, I am a panhandler, that is, recognized by the city of Santa Barbara. It's $5 a year. You're making money that way. You're not hurting that person. What about a sign that says, this area is okay for panhandling? There's a couple areas that I've known of that I looked at.
You'll need to wrap up, please.
A couple streetways that could be allowed for panhandling. And lastly, the sit and lie ordinance is spelled incorrectly. I believe lie is L-A-Y in the way that you're using it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oriana Wagner. Okay, thank you. Warren Butler will be followed by Sharon Byrne.
Hello, thank you, and definitely support all your efforts. If you don't mind, I'm Warren Butler, the president of the Greater Santa Barbara Lodging and Restaurant Association, and I just wanted to pass on an email that I just received this morning from one of my board members that represents the entire association. This is from Tom Patton. Please, Council members Rouse, Hoskins, and Murillo, I am unable to attend the Ordinance Committee meeting today. However, I wanted to make you aware of a comment that I heard last week on an international flight out of LAX. Prior to departure, I overheard the 4 passengers in the middle section talking about Santa Barbara. I was expecting to hear wonderful comments. Unfortunately, the female passenger was telling her fellow travelers about a poor experience she had in our city. She had traveled to Santa Barbara with her 16-year-old son and could not believe how dirty and smelly, as in urine, certain parts of the downtown area were. As I was sitting in an aisle seat, I introduced myself and told her I lived in Santa Barbara and that we were actively working on making our city safer and cleaner. She then also mentioned that there were certain groups of homeless people that made her uncomfortable on State Street. I assured her we were also working on that issue and that I hoped that it would not dissuade her from returning to our city. She lives in Southern California and travels domestically and internationally and has visited Santa Barbara in the past, but really felt like things have changed for the worse. The city and hotels through TOT, TBID, and their own marketing budgets invest a lot of money to promote our area as a tourist destination. Kathy Janeka Dykes and her team at Visit Santa Barbara does a fabulous job of promoting Santa Barbara domestically and internationally. We need to make sure that we provide our guests with a clean and safe destination once they arrive in our city. Our local business owners and residents also deserve the right to a clean and safe downtown area. We are all sympathetic to the plight of truly homeless, and we have many organizations that serve this population. However, we need to make sure that we have the proper ordinances on the books so that we can enforce the laws when needed. As a board member of the Greater Santa Barbara Lodging and Restaurant Association and Visit Santa Barbara, I know this issue is a top priority. Thank you in advance for your work to ensure that we continue our positive momentum in cleaning up our downtown area and making this a clean and safe environment for our residents and visitors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sharon Byrne will be followed by Dave Hopkins.
I'm going to wear two hats in this conversation. First hat is as a downtown neighbor that lives a couple of blocks off of State Street. I applaud what you're doing here. I actually like walking to dinner at Zenya and some of the other restaurants in the 400, 500, and 600 block, and it's not always a very pleasant experience. So appreciate this. And as someone who's fighting off an encampment in the neighborhood of some of the folks that are hanging out in those blocks on State and causing a lot of problems, I would really like to see that cleaned up. So applaud the effort here. Ms. Murillo, thank you for thinking of Milpa Street, switching over to my other hat. Yes, sit-lie would be very appreciated over there. We have a few problematic blocks, nothing like what you have on State, but we have a few. But thank you very much for this effort, and I hope it prevails and it goes in the right direction. And I think Mr. Colon can steal you in areas to avoid suits from the likes of Mr. Marin. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final speaker will be Dave Hopkins.
Thank you, council members. And, I'm just up here. I do a lot of outreach for the homeless, and I'm out there every day trying to help out when I can with them. And, a couple of Fridays ago, there was a dead man at Persian Park, whatnot. And one of the big things is the people going to State Street that you're talking about and panhandling, and they're hungry. And there hasn't been a place to eat lunch in Santa Barbara for the homeless in a long time. There's, nothing at the Casa Esperanza. Catholic Charities used to do it. There's nothing there. And if you're hungry, you're probably going to ask for something to eat or some money to get some food. And then the urination and defecating is it's just like everybody else said. If there's no bathroom, what do you do? I mean, that's just common sense right there. And, it would take away the problem a little bit there. I would think if they had a place to go, they would go. But Santa Barbara doesn't have that for them and doesn't have a place for them to eat lunch. And I think if those two things were applied, this would cut down quite a bit on that thing. And Officer Casey used to be a great officer that was up and down State Street every day. And the people on State Street, the regular homeless, got to know him and respected him. And, it's the officers treating the people like human beings and asking them to move to the places where they can go, or finding something for people to do during the daytime is maybe something that we should start looking for the solutions, and not how to just keep pushing people around all over the place and just trying to find another solution next time we push them further down the street or push them over to Milpas. And then just, where do they go after that? From park to park to park? I mean, you see it every day. But there's no solutions that are being talked about. Thank you.
All right, very well. That concludes public comment. It's back to the committee. The way this is going to work is we have quite a bit of material to review, and I believe, given that we've got council at 2 o'clock, with the indulgence of the committee, I'm going to recommend that we put this forward to potentially next week for an ordinance committee meeting. Ms. Wan, does that meet with the schedule, if that's the pleasure of the committee?
There are no other ordinances. Let's see. I don't believe there is one scheduled for next week. I would have to verify that. There is one in November, but I don't believe next week is an issue. I will have to get back to you on that, though.
Well, this is clearly an important issue that everybody is very passionate about. So we want to make sure we give this the proper amount of time and consideration. So, Ms. Murillo.
Well, I was thinking we could do it before 2. What's your concern, Mr. Chair?
My concern is trying to rush through something that clearly has a lot of moving parts, and outside of a blanket approval of Mr. Colon's suggestion by the committee to move it forward, I would suggest we move this to another discussion period. Mr. Hotchkiss, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's a lot to talk about.
But so I'd be glad to put that to a vote if you'd like, Ms. Murillo, or do you have a preference?
I'm free next week at 12:30 if you wanted to. Is that what we're talking about, continuing this until then?
Yeah, I want to be very precise. I don't want to send something to council for them to have to, us, to chew over for another couple hours in the meeting. I want to get as much work done here as possible. Clearly, there's a lot of people that are very interested in the precise outcome of what we recommend to council. And the way this works is ordinance committee takes these suggestions. We may ask for certain clarification from the attorney, and we forward it to council the following week. And I believe that we're not, at least in my opinion, we're not quite ready to forward the entire body of work to council. And I would like to give one more meeting for deliberation's sake. Ms. Wan.
I did verify on the calendar that next week is available. November 11th is the only other time we have a different meeting scheduled. So
right.
Next week is fine.
Thank you. So with the permission,
Happy to, sure. Yeah, let's sure.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Do what?
Put it off next week? Okay. Glad you're paying attention to that. Right. All right, very good. Then we will do that. Thank you all for coming in. Thank you for speaking. We've got notes on everything you've said, and appreciate your participation. And this meeting is adjourned.